Our next speaker is Senator Jennifer Fielder, and I am pleased. I am greatly pleased to have her here. I've been kind of hard on her this last year, and I had to tell her that I still have a hard time trusting politicians, and that's going to be a hard one to get over. But she's gaining. She's gaining good. And so welcome, Senator Fielder.
Just a word of advice, never trust a politician. But I don't consider myself a politician, but an elected representative of the people of Sanders County and Mineral County and part of Flathead County and part of Missoula County. I'm one of you, and it's my privilege to have been elected by you and to go stand up in rooms full of politicians, speak the truth, and to try to help them to understand more about what's going on for those that don't get it. There are some good ones in the Montana legislature, let me tell you. Representative Teresa Manzella is here. Would you stand up, Teresa? She's a horsewoman, and she doesn't take no bull. So, in the legislative process, you do become somewhat transformed. I'm a regular person, but I have a higher responsibility because I'm held to a higher standard when I do speak. And I take that seriously. So, I'm not quick to jump on bandwagons. I do my homework, do a lot of homework. And I appreciate the people that provide me with information and concerns and bring concerns to my attention like the Ryan family has. So I started doing some homework on what caused the uprising in Burns, Oregon. Why did the Bundys and all these other people go there and occupy that bird refuge, risk their lives to do it? And so I started to lay out the facts of the Hammond case by reviewing the court records, the jury verdicts, the government records. I interviewed both of the Hammond wives, Stephen's wife and Dwight's wife. And here's what I found. And these are facts that I'm laying out into a resolution that will go before the President of the United States and the U.S. Congress. So I don't normally read in front of an audience, but it's very factual, and I want to make sure that I'm clear on that. So I'm going to read it. In the state of Oregon, federal agencies sentenced rancher Dwight Hammond, now 78, and his son Stephen Hammond, now 49, to 5 years in federal prison for the crime of utilizing common range management fires that spread slightly off of their own land and onto a small portion of adjacent public land, each causing less than $1,000 in damage. The charges and penalties levied against the Hammonds were extraordinarily severe, especially in light of the fact that federal land managers have, on numerous occasions, accidentally and purposely at times, burned thousands of acres of public land and private land, including homes, without consequence to the agency or its employees, and without compensation to the landowners whose property they destroyed. At the criminal trial of the Hammonds, the federal government's own witness actually testified that the fire that Dwight and Stephen were both found guilty of igniting actually improved the range, and that the Bureau of Land Management committed no suppression resources to the fire. In other words, they didn't spend any money on that fire, and the fire improved the range. Curiously, the charges against Dwight and Stephen Hammond were preceded by a long period in which the Hammonds had been publicly critical of federal land managers' actions. For decades, the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had deployed federal administrative powers to punitively regulate and prosecute the Hammond family in what now appear to be efforts to take over the Hammonds' ranch and water rights. For 20 years, the Hammonds warded off federal land managers' attempts to block them from trailing their cattle on to their lawfully held grazing lands via historic stock driveways that were verified in historical records. In 1994, the BLM and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service falsely arrested Dwight Hammond for protecting the Hammonds family, their legally owned water rights, and the Hammonds subsequently prevailed in state court by proving their vested water right claims. Between 1994 and 2006, even though the Hammonds held federal grazing permits that were attached to their statutorily protected grazing preference and their vested stock water rights, federal land managers stripped them of 3 BLM grazing permits and 1 Malheur National Wildlife Refuge grazing permit, thereby systematically gutting the economic viability of the Hammond Ranch. In 2001, after receiving BLM permission, Dwight and Stephen Hammond started a prescribed range management burn on their private land that accidentally spilled over to about 137 acres of adjoining public land upon which the Hammonds held the grazing rights and managed. However, Stephen reported that the fire had spread beyond his own property boundary. The government expert testified that the fire improved the range, and at the time the BLM didn't cite him for it. It wasn't for 9 years until they decided to cite him for it. So that was the 2001 fire. In 2006, during a violent thunderstorm, lightning ignited a wildfire that seriously threatened to wipe out the Hammonds' winter feeding grounds. And in a widely accepted firefighting practice, the Hammonds started a strategic emergency backfire on their private land, which successfully saved their winter grazing areas, protected their home and barns, and potentially saved thousands of acres of public land from being engulfed in the wind-driven flames. The 2006 backburn slightly encroached onto the adjacent public land, an estimated 1 acre. The jury concluding it cost less than $1,000 in damage. The Bureau of Land Management pursued criminal charges for the 2006 fire, for the backburn, in state court, but the district attorney reviewed the facts and declined to press charges. So that was 2006. And then, in 2010, just before the statute of limitations ran out on that 2001 fire, the one that improved the range, the BLM brought the Hammonds into federal court, indicting them on numerous charges relating to both fires. The BLM avoided bringing charges under their own statutes, which specifically provide an exception for crimes related to fires started by ranchers who own grazing allotments in certain circumstances. 18 U.S.C. subsection 1855 says, "This section shall not apply in the case of a fire set by an allottee in the reasonable exercise of his property rights on the allotment." So they didn't use that statute because it wouldn't result in a mandatory prison sentence. Normally, the BLM would cite the rancher with a trespass burn under its own statutes. That's the applicable citation. But instead of that, federal prosecutors charged Dwight and Stephen Hammond as arsonists under the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. This is the law that was enacted in response to Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing. They applied that law to these two ranchers. Eventually, all of the federal government's claims about the ranchers lighting fires on public lands and endangering federal employees and attempting to destroy government vehicles were proven unfounded. The jury said not guilty. 10 of the 13 most egregious charges against the Hammonds were either dismissed or concluded in the jury's not guilty verdict. The one count that Dwight was found guilty of related solely to the 2001 prescribed burn, which was ignited on the Hammonds' private land after his son Stephen had called the BLM dispatcher asking, quote, if it was okay to burn private land in the Steens Mountain area that day. And the BLM dispatcher on duty told Stephen at that time, quote, it was okay, that there were no burning restrictions anymore, unquote. This from the trial records. Whereas, in the end, the Hammonds were only found to have been involved in 2 range management fires that they had started on their own land and conducted in accordance with standard techniques that are common among ranchers, farmers, and public land managers in the area. The federal district court judge that heard the case declared, quote, it would be cruel and unusual punishment for this crime to give them the mandatory minimum of 5 years, unquote, as required under the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. In fact, the judge issued a sentence of 1 year for Stephen and 90 days for Dwight, and he even allowed the men to serve staggered terms so they could continue to keep the family ranch afloat. But after finally succeeding in a conviction against the Hammonds, albeit minuscule, the federal government filed an outrageous claim for damages in the amount of $1.3 million in a civil suit. And then they offered, in what many would say, and I would agree, amounts to extortion, to drop all charges on the condition that the Hammonds sign over 2/3 of their ranch to the federal government.
Wow.
Facing perhaps the largest and most well-funded law firm in the world, the United States government, and under extreme duress, the Hammonds agreed to a plea that would lower the fine from $1.3 million to $400,000 and require that they give the BLM the first right of refusal to purchase their ranch if for some strange reason they were ever required to sell it. The Hammonds paid the fine and they served out the sentences that the judge had handed down of 1 year for Stephen and 90 days for Dwight. But then the federal government pressed forward with another criminal, on more criminal charges, or on the same criminal charges, but to an appeal for resentencing, asking for the full force of the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act to be applied to these men in a relentless effort to lock Dwight and Stephen up for a full 5 years. The very sentence the federal district court judge had declined to apply, saying such a harsh punishment under the circumstances, quote, would shock the conscience, unquote. And that's what happened. People's consciences were shocked. in what many in the West and across the nation view it as a manifest miscarriage of justice, very much akin to double jeopardy, Dwight and Stephen Hammond were indeed resentenced to 5 years in federal prison, and they were required to serve their sentences at the same time, making it impossible for them to help keep the family ranch going. They remain incarcerated to this day. Although the Hammonds went away quietly and declined to protest, declined to publicly criticize under threat, they didn't participate with the march and the protest, the march that happened in Burns, Oregon, nor did they condone the takeover of the wildlife refuge. But numerous Americans knew something was very, very wrong, and they risked their lives in a symbolic occupation of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge to bring a national spotlight to the plight of the Hammonds and to request a peaceful redress of many other grievances concerning the federal government's heavy-handed control of half of all lands in Western America. Now, in a separate but related case, which you'll hear a lot more about from other folks, and I won't get into too many details today, but in the state of Nevada, a case of conflict between the BLM and Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy had culminated in a tense standoff between BLM law enforcement agents and hundreds of conscientious Americans who had come to Bundy's aid. The federal government pressed charges against Bundy, his sons, and supporters for their role in this Nevada standoff, as well as charges against Ammon and Ryan Bundy and others that participated in the Malheur occupation. And then, it didn't look like they had much chance. And they did a lot of work on their own. I'm going off script here a little bit. Did you know Ryan represented himself in court? Yep. And how many counts? 5 in Oregon, 16 or 17 in Nevada, and he won every one of them. Shawna Cox, who you'll hear from a little bit later after the break, represented herself as well. And she won. But I know they'll tell you they didn't do it alone. Okay, so I don't want anyone to leave here today thinking that all people in the federal government are bad, because there's a lot of good ones in there. We need to remember that. There's good people with families, and they care about this country. They love this country just like we do. So don't go away from here with a stereotype about government or even politicians. Hopefully I break that mold for you on the politician part. In a 17-page whistleblowing letter released by Bureau of Land Management Special Agent Larry Wooten, who was the lead investigator in the Nevada standoff, he cited multiple cover-ups within federal agencies and, quote, a widespread pattern of bad judgment, lack of discipline, incredible bias, unprofessionalism, and misconduct, as well as likely policy, ethical, and legal violations among senior and supervisory staff. 17-page memo, all documented. He was retaliated against as well. Agent Wooten's whistleblower letter disclosed that a senior BLM law enforcement supervisor had bragged of having a kill list, and that BLM Law Enforcement Operations Center had photographs of Bundy and a supporter. I believe it was the lady who spoke earlier, her husband, Andrea's husband, Eric Parker. This BLM Law Enforcement Operations Center had a photograph of Cliven Bundy on the bulletin board. They had probably everybody up there, but on Cliven's picture and Eric Parker's picture, they had prominent X's drawn through their heads and their bodies.
Wow.
On December 20th, 2017, just 1 month ago, U.S. District Judge Gloria Navarro declared a mistrial in the Nevada standoff case, citing, quote, flagrant prosecutorial misconduct, unquote, after it was discovered that the BLM and the Department of Justice had withheld massive amounts of evidence that contradicted the federal government's version of events that led up to the Nevada standoff and well could have exonerated the ranchers. Among key evidence hidden by the BLM and the Department of Justice were records proving that before the Bundy family summoned neighbors and friends and the county sheriff and the governor and legislators and citizen militia to come to their defense, the BLM had placed deadly sniper teams in position around the Bundy home, while other agents began to covertly and brutally execute his cattle. On January 10th, 2018, the chairman of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Natural Resources and the chairman of the Congressional Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee issued a letter concerning numerous and serious reports of misconduct and possible criminal activity within the Bureau of Land Management related to the Bundy case and likely others. The aforementioned congressional chairman's letter states, quote, the failures in the Bundy case and previous cases display serious misconduct by BLM law enforcement officials and strongly suggests that there are systemic issues within BLM's law enforcement operations. And that's putting it nicely. We have yet to know the degree to which federal administrative and prosecutorial powers have been weaponized in a concerted effort by the federal land management and environmental agencies, aided by federal courts and the Department of Justice to extort exorbitant fines from law-abiding citizens, to deprive them of their property, to denigrate their character, to block lawful and beneficial uses of public lands, and destroy the lives and livelihoods of hardworking Americans. We've just scratched the tip of the iceberg, I'm afraid. For the rule of law to mean anything in this country, it must be applied equally to everybody. The resolution I am submitting for consideration, and I'm asking every organization that will hear of it in the country, you can bring it with you, sign the petition in the front, is called a resolution supporting justice for Western ranchers. And it says, we the people hereby petition the President and the Congress of the United States of America to do all within their respective powers to effect the following. Number 1, to grant a full pardon of Dwight and Stephen Hammond. Number 2, to extinguish the federal government's first right of refusal on the Hammond Ranch. Number 3, to amend the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996 to never again be improperly applied to the people who use backfire to protect their own property. To recognize and honor the Hammond and Bundy Ranch grazing rights. To grant a full pardon of the Malheur and Bunkerville protesters. And to ensure that all government conduct related to the Hammonds, Bundys, Malheur, and Bunkerville protesters be fully investigated so that the malicious misconduct and criminal acts committed by government agencies and their employees against the people are exposed, halted, and prosecuted. Now, justice sometimes is a hard thing. Do you believe in justice?
Yes.
Okay, we've got to let the justice system work. Innocent until proven guilty. Let the evidence be heard. Let it be presented. And let justice be done. God bless you and God bless America. God bless the Bundys, the Ryans, all the people that have come to their aid, all the people who have been afflicted by injustices, Billy Hill, and all those other people out there whose stories are yet to be told. We're with you. I stand with the people that want transparency and truth and justice. I'm glad you stand with me. Wonderful.